LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guests today are Hugh Newman and Jim Vieira, who join us to discuss their book, The Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain. Did giants really exist in the British Isles? Do the legends of them building Stonehenge hold any reality? Why do the establishment deny they ever existed? Hugh and Jim, best-selling authors of Giants on Record, America's Hidden History, and stars of History Channel's Search for the Lost Giants, investigate these claims and take a deep dive into obscure newspaper accounts, antiquarian diaries, archaeological reports, local history records, newly translated ancient texts, academic papers, new scientific reports, and written evidence from hundreds of sources going back over a 4,000-year period to uncover the truth. Over 250 accounts of the remains of giant human skeletons ranging from 7 feet to 21 feet have been found in the archaeological and historical record, often measured and commented on by famous scientists, scholars and writers at the time. A wealth of folklore from England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland talk about sophisticated cultures of giants with supernatural powers and advanced technology who had control over thunder and lightning, as witnessed when their tombs were disturbed by later generations. They were often high kings and queens who were master geomancers, surveyors, architects and astronomers who ruled from their mountaintop fortresses, whilst others were cannibals with violent tendencies who enjoyed throwing gigantic rocks across the landscape. The authors take a close look at these age-old stories and the remarkable skeletal discoveries to reveal for the first time an important lost chapter of British history. Related subjects discussed include the existence of Atlantis and other antediluvian civilizations, whether humans have existed for far longer than is currently accepted, global flood and catastrophe myths and legends, and whether differing atmospheric conditions in the distant past allowed life on Earth to grow to enormous sizes compared with the last few millennia. Hello and welcome, Hugh and Jim. Thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Greg.
Okay, today, guys, we're going to be discussing your new book that's entitled The Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain. Before we dive into that, if for listeners who don't know, if you could each just give a little bit of information about your background and your work in general.
My name's Jim Vieira. I'm from Massachusetts. You might be able to figure that out. I'm a stonemason by trade. I studied economics at the University of Massachusetts. I've been interested in ancient mysteries, though, probably since my early teens. Interested in metaphysics, lost worlds, Edgar Cayce's material, the mystics. Just intuitively felt there was kind of a different story to humanity. And personally, I've done a series of shows for the History Channel with my brother and Hugh. I've done one, Search for Lost Giants, a couple on the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and I've appeared probably on a dozen other shows like Ancient Aliens and Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. And I'm an co-author of 2 books, and I think that's about it.
Yeah, okay. My name's Hugh Newman. I'm a megalithomaniac. Founded the Megalithomania Conference back in 2006 with John Martineau and Gareth Mills, and yeah, I kind of got into this from more the paranormal realm, but then drifted into megaliths big time, and it kind of took over my life. And yeah, I've got a few books out, Earth Grids. I've got one on stone circles. Like I say, the 2 books with Jim, Giants on Record, and the Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain. And yeah, I'm a traveller. I travel around the world documenting this on my Megalithomania UK YouTube channel. And yeah, we've got we do quite a bit. We do quite a bit of organising of events and tours and things like that too.
Okay, so megaliths are a whole subject area unto themselves. It's fascinating. I've done many shows on that. The existence in the past of giants, whatever that is, whatever that looked like, is also an entire subject area in itself. What's the connection here that you're making in the book?
I'll say when you travel around the world, whether it's in Sacsayhuaman or Pumapunku, you have these legends of giants building the structures, actually passed from the indigenous people to the Spanish explorers. Then you have accounts of bones being unearthed that are of giant size. You have legends at Stonehenge, for instance, of giants. And then you have, as we highlight in the book, several giant skeleton unearthings as well that are documented by noted historians. And yeah, the mythology, the legend seems to be that like the Cyclops and these other beings were associated with megalith building. Now you could take it as a fantasy, as a folklore, or you could view it from a different lens of a lost world. The mystics, Edgar Casey, Steiner, Blavatsky, they would point to the existence of lost continents like Lemuria and Atlantis, and that's one of the sides of the story, is that in Ireland especially you have the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians showing up from a lost continent in the middle of the Atlantic. There were giants among the ranks. They're portrayed as benevolent and malevolent. And basically there's just this vast worldwide connection with giants and megaliths.
Do you have anything to add, Hugh?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially in Britain, we have a very strong connection between, the giants and the megaliths. It's quite profound. I mean, the most obvious one is the fact that Stonehenge was called the Giant's Dance, as recorded back in the 1100s, in the history of the kings of Britain, and before that, apparently, as well, according to some earlier texts. But many giants' graves, giants' tombs, giants' hills, and everything else are found all across the British Isles. I mean, virtually every part of the British Isles has these very strong traditions and quite elaborate legends that claim, how these sites were built and who built them, even named giants in like Cornwall and Wales especially. And often they have different qualities, these giant myths, of who these giants were. Some of them were very nice, some of them were kind of, benevolent, some of them were kind of super nasty cannibals. Others were building sites, throwing stones across the landscape in certain geometries, marking out stuff. So there's a lot of kind of encoded information when you get into the stories of the giants, especially their relation to the megalithic sites.
Well, from my research, it seems that the tallest human on record was a guy called Robert Wadlow. And he reached a height of 8'11", which is unimaginable, but there it is. Now, he died young, because he got an infection after an injury when he was just 22, but it was nothing to do with his height, as I understand it, his size. And he was apparently, incredibly physically strong, as you might expect. There was another guy called, John Rogan. He's kind of second on the list of tallest humans, verified. And he was 8'6", and he died around age 36, 37. There's some dispute over when he was actually born, and he was actually not in good physical shape. Really, he really suffered from being so tall. The reason I mention this is because there's no obvious correlation between being large and being healthy or unhealthy or strong or weak. I mention these guys, and there's a laundry list of other human beings verified as being over 8 foot tall, is that this has happened, this does happen. So extraordinary large humans are a thing. So whether you call them giants or not is another matter, but it's physically a thing. Now, in my reading of Fortean phenomena and all sorts of weird and wonderful stories over the decades, one of the issues with tales of giants has been that the field is unfortunately, in terms of evidence, is replete with hoaxes and exaggerations, and this is no doubt something that you've come up against with your research.
Yeah, certainly. I'll quickly say that in Northern Ireland, the highest incidence of pituitary gigantism, the condition you're talking about where you have a tumor on the pituitary gland and it causes out of control growing like Robert Wadlow. The highest incidence is in Northern Ireland in Ulster County, where the Tuatha De Danann landed. And you could view it as maybe it's inbreeding or interbreeding that took place in a genetic rejection. Or just like when you have polydactylism, 6 fingers and toes, you have high incidence of that occurring in the Four Corners area of the United States, where the Pueblo peoples have a much higher incidence than the normal population. So these mythological traits seem to be blended in with the general population. I'll say to the idea that a lot of what we research, they're just acromegaly and pituitary gigantism. Oftentimes there are multiple skeletons that are unearthed, 3 or 4, 8 foot tall, over 9 foot tall. This isn't just a disease condition.
There's also, you've got to remember that, when you're looking at these kind of hoaxes and exaggerations, we go into those. I mean, it's something we very, we kind of focus on, actually. We look for the hoaxes, we look and we expose them. And, there's a lot of quite famous ones in America, in Britain and around the world that we've investigated and actually put them in as hoaxes in the book, made it very clear what is what. But everything we kind of tend to include in our research, we dig into the accounts as far as we can go, and if there's no real evidence of hoaxes, then we think it's worthy of inclusion. But we have found one of the most famous ones is obviously the Antrim Giant, which was found in late 1800s, according to a Strand magazine, and it's been in many publications. It was like a fossilized giant, 12 foot 6 inches tall or so. But Jim did a lot of research into that, and for years we thought it was real, until we properly took a deep dive into the research. And Jim spent months digging around and found this whole trail of hoaxes, linking it with American hoaxes and much more. So, just what you got to add. I mean, Jim knows more about it than me, really.
Well, I was also going to say that in the Smithsonian's own records in the United States, there's 17 over 7 foot skeletons, over 8 foot skeletons. A skull that was 36 inches in diameter from Illinois. You have many instances of sober academics talking about dimensions that are well out of normal range. And the same thing holds true in the British Isles, where you have Sir Thomas Elliot and other well-known professionals identifying a stationary object that everybody's familiar with and giving straightforward anatomical measurements. So that's what grabs our attention. If it was just kind of these vague myths and legends and accounts that seem out of sorts, we wouldn't be doing a deep dive into it. We really feel like there's a story here.
Yeah, I think the perception when someone says the word giant is they think of, for example, a fairy tale like Jack and the Beanstalk, and they think the giant has to necessarily mean, a humanoid being like tens of feet high, so much bigger than an average human. Whereas actually in some accounts, for example, of the tale of David and Goliath, Goliath is pitched at like less than 8 feet tall, just a really fucking big guy, but not 100 feet tall with his head in the clouds.
Yeah, I think we firmly established that there was, in the United States, a race of 7 foot tall, or a ruling class, I should say, of 7 to 8 foot tall Native American shamans and wisdom keepers that would have a bloodline that was kept together for thousands of years. They were talked about by the early explorers. All the early explorers you can name, from John Smith to Magellan de Soto, they encountered giant native chiefs that were depicted as 7.5, 8.5, over 9 foot tall, tallest, on their knees, taller than any man that they had ever seen, things like that. And then down in Patagonia in the late 1800s, Frederick Cook was an explorer, and he took pictures of the Ona people who their traditions say came from a lost land. And there's a 6'6" woman, 7'6" male that he identifies in photographs. And basically the tribe was between 6.5 to 8 foot tall, documented before, unfortunately, they were all wiped out by genocide. You have lots of native people that not only have the traditions, they have the rulers who are like that. In the British Isles, it's the same thing. But when you get into 10, 11, 12-foot skeletons, I have not seen or DNA tested something that large, although pretty sober individuals have highlighted these finds. And I understand that the general public will not jump on board wholeheartedly until that occurrence takes place. But there is a mystery beyond that, because the occurrence of the number of 7-foot and taller skeletons unearthed from the burial mounds of Europe and the United States and other places versus the general population is completely separate and different.
Well, what physical fossil evidence do we have? Stuff that, albeit you might have to make an appointment, but that we can go and see in terms of skeletons.
There's a limited number. We have to be quite honest with you. I mean, we know obviously there's the skeleton of Charles Byrne that is only not that old really, but extremely tall. But we also have, there's a couple of in Britain. We have the Thirsk Giant, which is in the Thirsk Museum, found at Castle Garth, I think just a few decades ago, and that's over 7 feet tall, and the remains of it are on display in this tiny local museum in Yorkshire. In America, we have the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, and I witnessed this myself. There's a 7'6" to 7'8" skeleton on display there, which could be Native American. There's a good case for that, and there's a lot of intrigue in how it was discovered and got to be put on display, because in America now, the problem with finding physical remains is that not only did the Smithsonian, we believe, cover it all up, and we've got made a very good case for that in our previous book on America, but also in 1990, the NAGPRA Act was enforced, and this is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where all Native American grave goods, bones, skeletons, burials were reburied and taken back to these Native American tribes in collusion with the federal government. So all that was on display, and there was a lot on display, and there are photographs, there's evidence, there's scientific measurements and documents of this, say that they were on display, but now it's literally illegal to even have a bone or a skull or anything like this.
Yeah, let me jump in here for a sec. In the 40s and the 50s and the 60s in the United States, you had anthropologists like Don Dragoo, head of the Carnegie. You had Webb and Snow, anthropologists at the Dover Mound from the University of Kentucky. You had Joseph Benthall for the University of Alabama at DeSoto's Cave. All those gentlemen found over 7-foot skeletons with massive jaw bones and bone structure, jaw bones that would fit over your face. Absolute, not NBA players, but like an NFL linebacker who's over 7 foot tall, 7'6", all documented. All the bones were repatriated in the DeSoto Cave. They buried them again. And then you get into the conspiratorial side. The Smithsonian's own head of record says the tallest skeleton that they have is 6'3", a Sioux with acromegaly, a Sioux Native American. And even in our show, we find the Steelville Cave in 1933. There was an 8.5-foot skeleton that was unearthed. We find the picture of it. We find the doctor's office where it was laid out, and University of Missouri anthropologists put it together, measured it, and shipped it to the Smithsonian. We have a 6-foot guy laying right next to the 8.5-foot skeleton. We talk about it on our show. It just doesn't seem to add up. So, that right there blows out of the water the claims that the Smithsonian only has a 6'3" skeleton. So we don't believe in vast conspiracies and guys with cigars around a round table. It's more just the human ego. Nobody likes to admit they're wrong. People are entrenched. There's true believers who are often immune to logic and reason. Then there are pseudo-skeptics who are more interested in being right and being kind of smarmy assholes than they are finding the truth. So we try to meet in the middle and be objective and highlight what science needs to occur to prove the case. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying it's tough to pin down evidence, but there has been a lot of it that has been verified and repatriated, especially in the United States.
Yeah, I've often wondered about the motivation. You mentioned conspiracies, cover-ups, but in any event, what the motivation would be. I mean, you mentioned ego. You certainly have researchers, historians, scientists thinking about grants, financial grants, about tenure, about their position within their field. But why there seems to be a drive to, when it comes to human origins, ancient history, evolution, to jump on anything and stamp out anything that seems to contradict the mainstream narrative. It's kind of like, is it really that important? Clearly it is in some way. But, the idea of, I might get my funding cut, or I might be, written off as a crank if I go down this, for me, that doesn't explain this, these reactions enough.
Yeah, no, you may be right. some examples are, say, the Clovis Barrier, for instance. For 50 years, there's been strong evidence that people were in the United States well before 12, 13, 14,000 years. But anytime even mainstream anthropologists and archaeologists presented their evidence, they were accused literally of falsifying evidence, of being incompetent. And these are shows from, like, Jim Artavazio from Meadowcroft Shelter in Pennsylvania on PBS, and anthropologists from the University of Texas making these claims. This is all, out there for anyone to see. And then finally, about a month ago, they found incontrovertible evidence that humans were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago at least, because the footprints that were found have the grass seed embedded in them. So they have the exact date that this occurred. So it's at least 23,000 years. And this has taken, and there's been so much pushback and so much divisiveness over the subject. And then you get into the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and all these other things. And it's just human nature. And I say that in a bad way, that humans are petty and oriented towards selfishness and being right. They're not self-reflective. And generally, there are some good people out there, but people, especially in the academic world, or with an axe to grind, just like true believers, they just are tribal, and their preferences are weaponized. They wouldn't investigate, like an academic would investigate the stuff Hugh and I did. It's just not in their mindset, So I really feel that that's a lot of it, and it's like politics and religion. People are weaponized in their attitudes, and it's like, you're on my team or you're on the other team, instead of like, let's meet in the middle and figure out the truth.
Because you got also, one of the main things we covered in our previous book was the whole Smithsonian issue. And because there's reports, there's literally hundreds of reports of people sending the skeletons, skulls and bones they're finding on their properties or in mounds to the Smithsonian, or there's the Smithsonian collecting them. We're talking hundreds, if not thousands, potentially, of giant bones and skeletons, evidence that we want to look at. And then, these people would contact the Smithsonian months later, and they'd be, no, doesn't exist, don't know what you're talking about, and just dismiss it. And this was like repeated over and over again. And it got to a point where it was so ridiculous, because there are 17 accounts of between 7 and 8 foot tall skeletons in Smithsonian's own annual reports of their own excavators digging at sites, discovering these bones and skeletons. And yet, at the end of the report, they claim they don't exist. And then years later, they claim nothing exists. So there's missing evidence, and a lot of people like the Smithsonian and other institutions have a lot to answer for.
Well, Jim, you mentioned the evidence for, humans being in North America all that time ago. I'm kind of interested in work with someone like, for example, Michael Cremo, the idea that humans might have been around on Earth for millions of years. Certainly, I'm with Graham Hancock on this. It's, with his series of posts that he keeps doing, stuff just keeps on getting older. But I think there's a long period of time, there in human history that so far we have not really taken into account. People might feel that millions of years is too much of a stretch. I think we just don't know.
That's a valid point. We know Michael, and he's done Hugh's conference in London, got to know him well. He's actually funny as hell. He's a great guy. He has done virtually the same thing that Hugh and I have done, is gone through the scientific and historical literature and pulled out all these sober accounts of these almost supernatural happenings. And he goes through one after the other after the other. And it's funny, and he got the same reaction we did, which we're trying to upend science and we're cranks, and it's like, no, we're not even making a hypothesis here. We're just laying it out case, like, isn't this fascinating? Or look at the ubiquitous nature of this phenomena, or look at the data that seems to be beyond coincidence. If you are into traditions and mythology, certainly there are engineers like the Sumerian gods that are mentioned as the creators of humans, and these things go back hundreds of thousands of years. And if you're into the mystical side of things as well, I just think it's you develop a hypothesis and then you engage science to prove it, but it takes a long time, unfortunately. Like recently they found the Dragonman skull of a Denisovan in 2018 in China, and it's an enormous skull, at least 146,000 years old. The Denisovans were first found in 2010, and they mated with us and Neanderthals. And so what it's stating is that our human ancestors were much larger than ever thought. We don't have the long bones yet, but it could be 8 to 9 foot tall. We still don't know yet. We know the teeth are absolutely enormous. So you have this verification that our ancestors had a higher cranial capacity and were much larger. They weren't dwarf like people. And then I'll add that hobbits have also been found in Indonesia that are a 3 foot tall human cousin. So, there is a lot of mystery out there. You can't claim a conspiracy and sit in your mother's basement and make up a bunch of stuff. But, you can bring these points to light and try to objectively solve the kind of the enigma of mythology and why science has never been able to grapple with it or make sense of it.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com